Usually when we look back at the really massive, sprawling empires of history, there's this expectation of solid ground.
Right.
Like you picture Roman roads just paving over everything in their path, or the Great Wall of China, literally cementing a border in stone.
Yeah, we like our history to feel grounded.
Exactly. You look at the ruins, the sheer unyielding scale of the architecture, and it's comforting in a way. We like to think of human civilization as a massive, immovable object, like a total triumph over the natural world.
Right. The standard narrative is always that a civilization finds a fertile, stable piece of land, they dominate it, and then they build this bedrock foundation that lasts for centuries.
But the stack of notes you've brought us today completely shatters that expectation. I mean, we are looking at a civilizational landscape that is literally and figuratively floating.
It really is.
We're doing a deep dive into the Aztec Empire, but through a very specific, very deliberate lens, which is the late medieval world.
Yeah, and just to establish the baseline here, the medieval window you've outlined in the notes spans roughly from 500 to 1500 CE.
Okay.
And the Mexica people founded their capital, Tenochtitlan, in 1325. They forged their imperial Triple Alliance in 1428, and they dominated central Mexico until the Spanish conquest in 1521.
So they are sitting right at the absolute tail end of this era.
Exactly. They act as a perfect, high-stakes case study of a late medieval society, one that's navigating immense instability, claiming sacred legitimacy, and battling in a hyper-competitive arena.
And looking through these materials you provided, what really stands out to me is how this specific historical analysis mirrors a deeply personal philosophy that you, the listener, have cultivated.
That really jumped out at me, too.
Right. Your notes describe a worldview where nature, whether that's a literal physical forest or just the unpredictable chaos of human life, is something you learn to move with, rather than trying to violently dominate it. You talk about taking the painful, precarious elements of existence and channeling them into intentional forward motion. You refuse to go numb when things get dark.
And that is the exact through line for this entire exploration today.
It really is.
The Aztec civilization lived that exact philosophy, but on a massive imperial scale. They built a society facing constant environmental instability, an incredibly precarious geography, and endless conflict.
Yeah, and their response to that chaos wasn't detachment.
No.
It wasn't to hunker down in fear. Their response was this vivid, sacred, almost overwhelming intensity. They answered the instability of the universe by building rigorous, brilliant structures.
And to understand how they managed that, we really have to start with the dirt.
Or, more accurately, the mud.
Right, the mud. We have to look at the incredibly precarious place they decided to build their home.
Okay, let's unpack this geography, because it's wild. We're talking about the Basin of Mexico.
Yes. The Basin of Mexico is a fascinating geological anomaly. It's a vast, high-altitude plateau about 7,000 feet above sea level.
Which is really high.
Very high. And it's completely surrounded by volcanic mountains. Because there's no natural outlet for water, the runoff from those mountains formed a massive, interconnected system of 5 shallow lakes.
Okay.
The largest of these was Lake Texcoco. The Mexica people, after generations of migrating and acting as subordinate mercenaries for other established powers in the basin.
Because they were essentially the new kids on the block, right?
Exactly. They were late arrivals. But they finally founded their capital of Tenochtitlan in 1325 on a small, swampy island right in the middle of this lake.
And the mythology says they chose it because they saw an eagle perched on a prickly pear cactus eating a snake.
Right, a divine sign from their patron god, Huitzilopochtli.
But, I mean, peeling back the mythology to look at the geopolitical reality, it looks like a terrible piece of real estate.
Oh, strategically, it seems like a nightmare at first glance.
Like, it's deciding to build a massive metropolis in a swamp surrounded by rival gangs. Lake Texcoco wasn't even fresh water, was it?
No, it was largely brackish. Highly saline in the eastern and central parts.
So you have a growing population on a muddy island surrounded by salty water, and you are completely boxed in by powerful, aggressive rival city-states on the mainland.
Right.
You have an incredible natural moat for defense, sure, but how do you feed everyone? You can't farm salt water.
The environment demanded an engineering miracle, and they delivered one in the form of the chinampas.
The famous floating gardens.
Well, we often hear them called floating gardens, but that's actually a mistranslation.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that term obscures the actual mechanics of what they achieved. They didn't float at all. The chinampas were artificial, highly engineered agricultural plots built directly into the shallower freshwater zones of the lake system. primarily in the southern lakes of Zucumelco and Chalco.
The mechanics of how they actually built these things are staggering to me. It wasn't just throwing dirt in the water and hoping it stays.
No, it was incredibly labor-intensive.
They would stake out these long, narrow, rectangular enclosures in the shallow lake bed using woven reeds and wattle, right?
Yes. And then they would layer mud from the bottom of the lake, decaying vegetation and human waste. They'd build it up until the surface rose a few feet above the water level.
But how does a pile of mud not just wash away in a storm?
That's the genius part. To keep the whole thing from washing away, they planted specialized willow trees, the aquati, at the corners and along the edges.
Wow.
The root systems of those trees would grow down and physically anchor these artificial islands right into the lake bed.
It is a profound example of ecological engineering.
Absolutely.
Because by building these raised beds in the water, they created an agricultural system where the crops had constant year-round access to moisture from the water table below.
Right. They didn't have to rely strictly on the seasonal rains.
So they could harvest crops like what? Maize, beans, squash, tomatoes, amaranth.
Yeah, all of that, up to 3 or 4 times a year.
That's insane. For context, European agriculture at the exact same time was lucky to get 1 solid harvest a year, or maybe 2 in exceptional climate.
The Chinampas yielded an astonishing amount of caloric density, which is honestly the only way a centralized island metropolis could eventually sustain hundreds of thousands of people.
But wait, I have a question about the water.
Sure.
If Lake Texcoco was largely salty and brackish, how are they sustaining freshwater agriculture? I mean, saltwater ruins crops instantly. If the lakes are interconnected, a strong flood season would wash the saline water straight into the freshwater zones and wipe out the entire food supply.
That vulnerability forces them to engineer an even larger mechanism.
Okay.
In the mid-1400s, working alongside their allies in Texcoco, they constructed a massive public works project known as the Dike of Nezahualcóyotl.
Right.
It was a 10-mile-long stone and timber barrier stretching right across the lake.
10 miles long, just built by hand in the water.
Entirely by hand. This dike physically separated the brackish waters of eastern Lake Texcoco from the freshwater surrounding Tenochtitlan and those southern lakes.
Wow.
It served a dual purpose, really. It controlled the catastrophic flooding during the rainy season, and it protected the delicate ecological balance of the Chinampa zones. They manipulated the hydrology of an entire basin without destroying the lake itself.
And this ties directly back to your note to the listener about not fighting the unpredictable elements of your life, but moving with them.
Exactly.
The Mexica didn't attempt to drain the lake. They didn't try to pave over the water with massive stone platforms like we would today. They looked at a saline, flood-prone swamp and integrated their survival right into its natural behavior.
They lived within the paradox of a natural world that sustained them, but could also annihilate them at any moment.
That paradox extended beyond just the environment, though, right? It bleeds into the political reality of the basin.
Oh, absolutely. The Valley of Mexico was not an isolated frontier. It was one of the most densely populated regions on Earth at the time.
Wow.
When the Mexica arrived, the land was already partitioned among dozens of established altiplano, which are essentially sovereign Mesoamerican city-states. Geography dictated that Tenochtitlan would never, ever enjoy isolation.
Survival required hypervigilance.
Yes. They had to navigate shifting alliances, engage in diplomatic marriages, intimidate their neighbors, and eventually implement a strategy of relentless expansion.
Which brings us to the architecture of their power. Building on that concept of a crowded basin,
Right.
if you are living in a high-stakes arena where dozens of city-states are vying for the exact same resources, how do you organize your society to dominate? Because the standard European model of empire usually involves conquering a territory, wiping out the local ruling class, putting your own governor in charge, and forcing everyone to assimilate to your culture and language.
Right, the Roman model.
Exactly. But the texts outline a totally different mechanism for the Aztec Empire.
The political structure they developed perfectly aligns with the late medieval lens of our deep dive. What's fascinating here is that the Aztec Empire was not a monolithic, uniformly administered state.
Okay.
It was a system of hegemony. It relied on shared, layered, and fiercely contested authority. At the very top, you have the Tlatoani, which translates to he who speaks.
Right.
The Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan held immense power. But he wasn't an unquestioned absolute monarch by divine right in the way European kings claimed to be.
Yeah.
His authority had to be proven constantly through military success, economic management, and elite consensus.
Wait, so it wasn't a top-down absolute monarchy where the emperor snaps his fingers and everyone just obeys blindly?
Not at all. It was much more precarious.
And the power didn't even reside solely with the Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan, did it? The foundation of what we call the Aztec Empire was actually the Triple Alliance.
Yes. In 1428, after a massive regional conflict called the Tepanec War, Tenochtitlan allied with two other major city-states, Texcoco and Tlacopan. They overthrew the dominant power in the basin and formed a unified military and economic coalition. They literally split the profits of conquest. Tenochtitlan and Texcoco each got 2/5 of all tribute, and Tlacopan got 1/5.
And how they managed those conquests reveals the core mechanism of their empire. When the Triple Alliance marched into a neighboring region and defeated a rival Altitetl, they rarely dismantled the local government.
Right, they didn't leave massive standing armies behind to occupy the territory.
They didn't force the conquered people to speak Nahuatl or abandon their local gods.
No. Instead, they left the defeated local ruler on his throne, provided he agreed to two conditions.
Which were?
Acknowledge the supremacy of the Triple Alliance and pay a massive regular tribute.
I read this in the notes and I immediately thought of a mafia protection racket.
That's actually a very apt analogy.
I mean, the Triple Alliance wasn't interested in the administrative headache of running your city. They just wanted your stuff. They show up, burn down the local temple to prove they can, and say, congratulations, you still run your town, but every 80 days you are going to send us 400 cotton cloaks, 20 bags of cacao beans, and 3 live jaguars. And if the shipment is late, we will come back and destroy you.
The protection racket analogy captures the economic reality perfectly. It was an empire built on extraction, not assimilation. The goal was to siphon wealth and resources from the periphery straight into the center.
Right.
But while that system is economically brilliant, it introduces a massive structural weakness.
Oh, for sure.
If you leave the local kings in power and your entire empire is just a sprawling network of people paying you solely because you threaten them, you are sitting on a powder keg of resentment.
Because control does not equal unity. You haven't integrated these provinces, you've just terrified them.
Yes, and that means you can never, ever afford to look weak. The moment a local ruler suspects the Triple Alliance doesn't have the military bandwidth to punish a rebellion, the tribute stops, the local armies mobilize, and the whole network fractures.
The empire only exists as long as the threat of violence remains credible.
Which is why the cellular structure of Aztec society was so critical. To maintain that constant projection of force, the internal organization of Tenochtitlan had to be incredibly disciplined. Below the level of the Tlatoani and the high nobility, the society was organized into units called calpulli.
The sources really emphasize the calpulli as the true engine of the daily empire. It's often translated as a neighborhood or a ward, right?
It is, but that's inadequate.
Oh.
It was so much more comprehensive than a neighborhood.
How so?
A calpulli was essentially a foundational corporate group. It was a collective of families, often tied together by a specific trade or a shared ancestral lineage.
Okay.
The calpulli owned the land collectively. Individuals only had the right to use the land as long as they worked it. But the calpulli was also the basic unit for tax collection, for organizing labor drafts, for public works like building those dikes we talked about, and most importantly, for military conscription.
Ah, so that's how they raised the armies.
Yes. When the Tlatoani declared war, he didn't have to round up individual men. He called upon the calpulli leaders, and each calpulli provided its own trained, equipped squadron of warriors.
So you have this deeply fractured, heavily layered map of authority.
Regularly.
You have the Triple Alliance at the top, managing a web of extorted, resentful tribute states on the outside. Internally, you have these calpulli units organizing the labor and the military down to the family level. To keep an engine like this from stalling out, you need constant motion.
Constant.
You have to keep expanding, keep extracting, and keep demonstrating your power. If you have an empire built on compliance rather than loyalty, how do you keep it running and prevent rebellion?
Well, the economy and the military were entirely fused. You cannot separate them. The engine of the empire ran on 3 interlocking pillars: the Chinapai agriculture feeding the core, the tribute system extracting raw wealth from the conquered provinces, and the sprawling market system that distributed those goods. But the glue holding that entire economic network together and acting as the vanguard of imperial expansion was a highly specialized class of people called the Pozteca.
I get so excited talking about this group. The Pochteca are arguably the most fascinating group in this entire societal structure. Calling them merchants feels entirely inadequate.
It definitely doesn't do them justice.
They weren't just guys with wooden carts hauling tomatoes to the next town over. They were an elite hereditary guild of long-distance traders who essentially operated as a state-sponsored intelligence agency. They are like a guild of medieval James Bonds of Mesoamerica.
Their operational mechanics were incredibly sophisticated. The Pochteca undertook massive expeditions, walking hundreds of miles outside the borders of the empire, down into the jungles of what is now Guatemala and the Soconusco coast.
Just trekking through hostile territory.
Exactly. They carried manufactured goods from Tenochtitlan obsidian blades, copper bells, woven textiles, and traded them for high-value luxury items, things like quetzal feathers, jade, turquoise, and cacao beans. But their economic function was, in many ways, secondary to their geopolitical function.
They were the eyes and ears of the state.
Yes.
When the Pacheca entered an unconquered territory, they weren't just setting up shop, they were scouting. They were mapping the terrain, noting the locations of the freshwater springs, assessing the size and armament of the local military forces, and gauging the political stability of the ruling class.
They gathered the exact intelligence the Triple Alliance military needed to plan a conquest.
And because they were so deeply embedded in statecraft, they operated under strict, almost secretive protocols, didn't they?
Very strict. When they returned to Tenochtitlan after its successful expedition, they didn't march through the city displaying their incredible wealth during the day. That would incite the jealousy of the warrior nobility, which was dangerous.
So what did they do?
Instead, they would sneak back into the city at night, quietly transferring their goods into secure warehouses. They had their own internal courts, their own specific gods like Yakatecutli, the god of commerce, and their own rigid internal hierarchy.
And if a foreign state recognized what the Pachtica were actually doing, spying and attacked or killed them,
Yeah.
it was an immediate pretext for war, right?
Oh, instantly.
Mm.
The Tlatoani would declare that the honor of the empire had been insulted and the army would march.
Wow.
And that brings us to the military machine itself. Because the Aztec Empire emerged in such a hyper-competitive landscape, warfare wasn't an anomaly. It wasn't a last resort when diplomacy failed. Warfare was the primary mechanism for social mobility, economic survival, and state legitimacy.
But we have to understand the mechanics of Aztec warfare here, because it operated on a completely different logic than European warfare of the same era.
Totally different.
The goal of an Aztec military campaign was rarely a war of annihilation. They did not want to wipe a city off the map, slaughter its population, and burn its fields.
Because a dead city pays no tribute.
Exactly. If you massacre the farmers and burn the Chinampas, you've just conquered a worthless piece of scorched earth. What's the point?
There is no point. The tactical objective was subordination, not destruction. The primary goal of an Aztec warrior on the battlefield was to incapacitate and capture the enemy alive, rather than killing them outright.
And this is perfectly reflected in their weaponry.
Yes. The signature weapon was the macahuitl, a wooden club embedded with razor-sharp obsidian blades.
And obsidian is sharper than surgical steel, right?
It can take an edge sharper than steel, yes, but it is brittle. The weapon was designed to maim, to cripple, to bring an opponent to their knees so they could be bound and taken captive. Capturing enemies alive was the sole path to social elevation. A commoner could rise to the ranks of the elite eagle or jaguar warrior societies purely based on the number of captives he brought back.
This philosophy of capturing rather than killing reaches its absolute peak in the geopolitical phenomenon known as the Flower Wars, or Xochitl.
Oh.
This is one of those concepts that just forces you to totally reevaluate how a state uses violence. The Flower Wars were highly ritualized, scheduled conflicts fought primarily against the city-state of Tlaxcala and its allies.
And Tlaxcala is a crucial piece of the geopolitical puzzle here. They were a powerful, fiercely independent confederacy located just east of the Valley of Mexico.
Okay.
Despite being completely encircled by Aztec territory, they were never conquered by the Triple Alliance. The standard assumption by early historians was that the Aztecs simply couldn't defeat them. But the historical reality of the Flower Wars suggests a much more calculated, cynical strategy.
Instead of launching a massive, all-out invasion to crush Tlaxcala once and for all, the Aztecs engaged in these scheduled battles.
Right.
The armies would meet at a prearranged location. The numbers of warriors were often agreed upon beforehand. It wasn't about gaining territory at all. It was about capturing prisoners.
It served multiple purposes. It allowed the Aztec state to continuously train new generations of warriors in live combat. It maintained a high level of political terror among their enemies, and it provided a steady stream of captives.
They essentially kept Tlaxcala around as a militarized training ground, like a captive farm.
It was a strategy of managed attrition. By surrounding Tlaxcala and engaging in these constant grinding skirmishes, the Aztecs economically isolated them. Tlaxcala had no access to salt, to cotton, to cacao. The Aztecs were slowly strangling them, using the flower wars to bleed their military strength while simultaneously fueling the Aztecs' own social and religious mechanisms.
But the strategy of managed attrition has a fatal flaw, doesn't it?
It does.
You are deliberately keeping a deeply traumatized, highly militarized, deeply resentful enemy alive right on your border. You are gambling that you will always be strong enough to manage the tiger you have by the tail. It's an incredibly dangerous way to structure an empire.
It is. And we must ask why they felt compelled to structure it this way. Why the constant need for captives? Why the relentless drive for expansion?
Right.
The answers to these questions cannot be found purely in economics or political science. To understand the engine of the Aztec state, we have to look at the fuel. We have to examine their cosmology. For the Mexica, relentless expansion wasn't just a political strategy, it was a cosmic mandate.
This is where the late medieval lens snaps perfectly into focus.
Yes.
Because in the medieval mindset, whether we're talking about Europe or Mesoamerica, the veil between the physical world and the divine world is paper-thin. Religion wasn't a private belief system you engaged with on a specific day of the week.
No, it didn't just influence politics, it was the politics. It structured the warfare, the legitimacy of the ruler, the architecture of the city, and the very concept of time itself.
So let's talk about the Mesoamerican universe.
The Mesoamerican universe was not a serene, static creation. It was a cosmos alive with violent, divine struggle. The overarching concept was Tittle, a dynamic, sacred energy that animated everything in the universe, from the sun down to a piece of jade.
Okay.
The pantheon of deities like Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, Tlaloc, the ancient god of rain and agriculture, and Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, were essentially manifestations of this energy. And these gods required immense, constant effort to maintain the balance of the universe.
And the physical manifestation of this worldview sat at the exact center of Tenochtitlan, right? The Templo Mayor.
Yes, the Great Temple.
It was a massive, stepped pyramid, but uniquely, it had two distinct shrines at the very top. One shrine was dedicated to Tlaloc, painted blue and white, representing water, fertility, and the ancient agricultural roots of the basin.
And the other shrine was dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, painted red and white, representing blood, warfare, and the sun.
So the state literally joined the forces of agricultural survival and imperial conquest at the architectural center of their world.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it brings us to the mechanics of human sacrifice, which is the most deeply misunderstood aspect of Aztec culture.
We really need to break this down carefully.
We do. To examine this accurately, we must completely strip away modern moral frameworks and view it from within their specific cosmological logic. To an outsider, the scale of Aztec sacrifice appears as sheer sadistic terror. But within their worldview, it was a literal, mechanical necessity for the continuation of existence.
The mythology explicitly lays this out. We have to talk about the concept of the five suns. The Aztecs didn't believe the world was created once and was just coasting forward forever, right?
Right. They believed the universe had been created and violently destroyed 4 times before they even existed. They believed they were living in the era of the fifth sun. And the myth of how the fifth sun was created dictates everything about their society.
Can you walk us through that myth?
The legend states that the gods gathered in the ancient city of Teotihuacan in total darkness. To create the sun and get it to move across the sky, a god had to throw himself into a blazing fire.
Wow.
The lowly, blistered god Nanahuatzin sacrificed himself, leaping into the flames, and rose as the new sun. But the sun just hung there in the sky, refusing to move. It demanded blood.
So it wouldn't start the day?
Exactly. So the rest of the gods sacrificed themselves, offering their blood to give the sun the energy it needed to begin its journey across the sky and create time.
That myth establishes the fundamental contract of human existence for them. Cosmic debt.
Yes.
The gods died so that humanity could live. The sun only moves, the rains only fall, and the crops only grow because the divine world expended its own life force. Therefore, humanity owes an unpayable, perpetual debt. Sacrifice wasn't an act of cruelty for fun, it was an act of cosmic responsibility.
The blood offered during sacrifice contained tonali, of vital life energy. By offering the hearts and blood of captives, the Aztecs believed they were physically feeding the earth and the sun, replenishing the divine energy that was constantly being depleted.
And if they didn't?
If the blood stopped flowing, the gods would starve, the sun would freeze in the sky, the rains would fail, and the universe of the fifth sun would end in catastrophic earthquakes.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Imagine the psychological weight of that reality. Time was not a guarantee. We think of time as a long, unending runway. They viewed time as a series of fragile cycles that could shatter at literally any moment.
And we see this terror manifest mechanically in their calendar system.
Right, because their relationship with time was incredibly complex, governed by two interlocking gears.
Exactly. They had a 260-day ritual calendar, the tonal Pawali, which governed prophecy, naming, and daily rituals. And they had a 365-day solar calendar, the Kawali, which tracked the agricultural seasons. These two calendars ran simultaneously, meshing together like gears.
And because of the math of those two cycles, they only aligned perfectly once every 52 years.
Right.
This alignment was the most terrifying moment in the Aztec century. It was the moment the universe was most likely to end.
It culminated in the new fire ceremony. As the 52-year cycle drew to a close, the entire population would extinguish every single fire in the empire.
Every single one.
All of them. They would break all their pottery, sweep their houses clean, and essentially prepare for the end of the world. On the final night, the high priests would climb the volcanic mountain of Huixatlan. They would wait in absolute darkness, watching the constellation of the Pleiades.
Okay.
If the stars continued to move across the zenith, it meant the gods had granted humanity another 52-year cycle. The priests would perform a sacrifice, kindle a new fire in the chest cavity of the captive, and runners would carry torches from that single flame to light the altars and hearths across the entire basin.
A society that believes the sun only rises because they kept it alive yesterday is a society driven by profound existential urgency. The instability of the universe demanded ritualized, unyielding structure. And I want to pause here to connect this directly back to the listener's core traits. You talk about holding joy right beside death. You understand that acknowledging the precariousness of life doesn't mean you surrender to it.
That's a powerful connection.
The Mexica lived with the creeping, undeniable closeness of cosmic collapse every single day. And their response was not emotional numbness. They answered that darkness with explosive color. They answered it with poetry, with music, with massive, awe-inspiring stone sculptures, and fierce communal presence. They made life incredibly vivid because they knew it was fragile.
Which naturally leads us to wonder, beneath this terrifying apocalyptic ceiling, how did society actually function? If you are an ordinary person living in Tenochtitlan, how does this cosmic dread and imperial extraction translate into the mechanics of a random Tuesday?
Right. You might imagine a society obsessed with the end of the world would be chaotic. But the historical sources reveal a metropolis that was astonishingly ordered, disciplined, and strictly regulated. The daily life of Tenochtitlan was structured down to the smallest detail.
Daily life was entirely dictated by your place in a rigid social hierarchy. At the top were the Pippleton, the hereditary nobility who held the high military, government, and priesthood positions.
How did they live?
They lived in massive palatial complexes, wore highly restricted garments of cotton and quetzal feathers, and consumed luxury goods like cacao.
And the rest of the population?
The vast majority were the Macehualtan, the commoners. They were the farmers working the chinapas, the artisans, the builders. They were clothing made of rough maguey fiber. Below them were landless peasants who worked the estates of the nobles, and at the bottom were enslaved people.
Though it's worth noting, Aztec slavery was different, right?
Yes, it was typically a temporary status entered into to pay off a debt or as a punishment for a crime, not an inherited lifelong condition.
But regardless of your social class, walking through Tenochtitlan would have been a staggering experience. It was one of the largest cities on the planet, with a population estimated between 200,000 and 300,000 people.
It was larger than London or Paris at the time.
You would see a city of canals, with thousands of canoes transporting goods and people, operating almost like modern urban traffic. You would see the massive aqueducts bringing fresh spring water from the mainland hills of Chapultepec right into the city center.
The infrastructure required to maintain public health in a dense, water-bound city is remarkable. The streets and canals were famously clean. A labor force of over 1,000 people swept the central precincts daily.
Wow.
Human waste was collected in canoes and transported out to the chinampas to be used as fertilizer, solving a massive sanitation issue while simultaneously feeding the agricultural engine.
And the beating heart of this daily life was the massive central market at Tlatelolco. Tlatelolco was originally a sister city on the island that Tenochtitlan eventually absorbed, right?
Exactly.
When the Spanish arrived, they were completely blown away by the scale of this market. Up to 60,000 people traded there every single day.
The organization of the Tlatelolco market reflects the intense structuring of their society. It wasn't a chaotic bazaar, it was highly zoned. There was a specific street for herbalists and apothecaries selling roots and medicinal plants. There was a section for barbers, a section for people selling specialized eating clays, a section for raw building materials, and a massive area for the trading of enslaved people.
And they didn't use minted coins, did they?
No, the economy operated on barter, but they used standardized currencies like large cotton cloaks, copper axes, and most commonly, cacao beans.
And to make sure this massive economic engine didn't devolve into fraud, the state maintained strict oversight. There was a dedicated building in the center of the market where market judges sat.
Right.
If someone caught a vendor selling watered-down honey or using a shaved measuring cup to sell maize, they could drag them before these judges for immediate, often severe, punishment.
That level of discipline wasn't just applied to the market. It was instilled in every citizen from birth. A hidden nuance of Aztec society, one that separates it from many of its European contemporaries, is its system of universal, mandatory education.
Wait, really? Every single child?
Every single child, regardless of gender or social class, was required to attend school.
That is a massive administrative undertaking. How did they actually execute that across hundreds of thousands of people?
Education was divided by class and managed locally by the Calpulli. The commoner children attended the Telpakali, or House of Youth.
What do they learn there?
The curriculum here was heavily focused on practical discipline, physical endurance, and military training for the boys, and agricultural and domestic skills for the girls. The state needed tough, capable soldiers and workers.
And the nobles?
The sons of the nobility and a select few exceptional commoners attended the Kalmakak. This was a rigorous academy attached to the temples, where they received advanced training in complex religious theology, astronomy, history, poetry, and statecraft administration.
The discipline in these schools was notoriously brutal, though. The codices show illustrations of parents and teachers punishing children by holding them over fires of roasting chili peppers to inhale the smoke, or piercing them with agave thorns.
Yes, the core philosophy was that human beings were born wild and unruly, and society had to forcefully shape them into obedient, capable components of the state. There was no find-your-own-path mentality. Your duty was to the gods, the Tlatoani, and the Calpulli.
So we have this incredibly vivid picture, a society that is beautifully ordered, deeply educated, efficiently managing a sprawling urban infrastructure, while simultaneously waging ritual warfare and feeding the cosmos to stave off the apocalypse.
That's a lot to hold together.
It really is. To understand how a system this tightly wound, this brilliant, but fundamentally this fragile eventually shattered, I think we have to look closely at the individuals steering the ship. History loves to rely on clean labels. We want the visionary builder, the weak failure, the heroic conqueror. But the sources you provided insist we look past the caricatures. So what does this all mean? Moctezuma isn't just weak. Cortez isn't just a hero or a villain. Cuauhtémoc isn't just a martyr. We need to examine the cast of characters who navigated this storm, starting with the men who engineered the empire's rise.
We begin with Itzcoatl.
Yeah.
He was the fourth Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan, ruling from 1427 to 1440. He is the foundational builder.
Okay.
When he took power, the Mexica were still subjects of the Tepani Empire. Itzcoatl is the leader who forged the Triple Alliance, successfully rebelled against their overlords, and established the tributary system that transformed Tenochtitlan from a mercenary state into a regional superpower.
He laid the physical and military tracks, but arguably the most influential figure in Aztec history wasn't a king at all. It was Tlacaelel.
Tlacaelel.
He served as the Sequacotl, a title meaning woman snake, which essentially functioned as the supreme advisor or grand vizier to several emperors, including Itzcoatl. Tlacaelel is the architect behind the throne. He is the man who engineered the Aztec ideological machine.
Tlacaelel recognized that military power wasn't enough to sustain an empire. You need a unifying supreme ideology. He essentially operated as a state propagandist.
Right.
After the Triple Alliance took power, Tlacaelel ordered the burning of the ancient historical codices of the conquered peoples, and even the early codices of the Mexica themselves. He claimed they were full of lies. He then completely rewrote the history of the basin.
It's the ultimate history is written by the victors move. He burns the old history and says, here is the new truth.
Precisely. He elevated Huitzilopochtli, their tribal god of war, to the supreme tier of the pantheon, explicitly linking him with the sun. Tlacaelel cemented the ideology that the Mexica were a divinely chosen people, whose unique sacred burden was to supply the sun with the blood of captives. He provided the theological justification for endless imperial expansion. The empire wasn't just conquering for wealth, they were conquering to save the universe.
And that ideological engine burned brightest and perhaps most dangerously under the rule of Moctezuma II.
Yeah.
He was the ninth emperor, coming to power in 1502. He inherited the empire at its absolute territorial and cultural zenith. Moctezuma was a deeply intellectual, highly severe ruler. He instituted massive administrative reforms, centralizing power even further.
He actually purged the government of the meritocratic commoners who had risen through the military ranks, replacing them exclusively with the hereditary nobility. He made the empire more rigidly hierarchical than ever before.
But of course, he is the emperor sitting on the throne in 1519 when a completely unimaginable variable enters the equation.
History has been incredibly judgmental of Moctezuma. The traditional, heavily Spanish-influenced narrative paints him as a weak, indecisive, superstitious coward who simply handed over his empire because he thought Hernan Cortés was the returning god Quetzalcoatl. We have to strongly push back on that narrative.
It's a complete oversimplification. Power systems place unimaginable burdens on those at the top, and Moctezuma was navigating an unprecedented extracontinental collision of worlds.
Exactly. He was a seasoned military commander dealing with a black swan event. When the Spanish landed, Moctezuma didn't have a global map. He had no intelligence regarding the existence of Europe, let alone the geopolitical motives of the Spanish crown.
Yeah.
He was managing an empire that, as we discussed, was built on extortion and compliance, boiling with internal resentment.
Right.
He made calculated, rational decisions based on the information available to him within his cultural framework. He tried diplomacy, he tried bribery, he tried psychological intimidation. To label him as a tragic, superstitious failure ignores the sheer impossibility of the situation.
Which brings us to the great disruptor, Hernan Cortés. It is so easy for older histories to paint him as a brilliant, heroic explorer, and for modern views to paint him purely as a one-dimensional villain. But stripping away the moral judgments, we have to look at the tactical reality of what he did.
Cortés represents the violent dawn of globalization. He was an opportunist. But the myth that a few hundred Spanish soldiers overthrew a massive empire purely because they had guns and horses is historically inaccurate.
Yeah.
Cortés succeeded because he brilliantly recognized and exploited the hidden structural weaknesses of the Aztec system that we outlined earlier.
He found the cracks. And the biggest crack was Tlaxcala.
Exactly. When Cortés marched inland, he initially fought the Tlaxcalans.
Yeah.
After a brutal stalemate, he realized they hated the Aztecs far more than they hated him.
Through the indispensable translation and diplomatic skills of Melanson, an enslaved indigenous woman who became his crucial advisor, Cortés formed an alliance with the Tlaxcalan Confederacy.
He didn't conquer Tenochtitlan alone. He marched on the capital with an army of tens of thousands of indigenous warriors who saw the Spanish as a tool to dismantle the oppressive Aztec tribute system.
But the Aztec state didn't just passively collapse. When the situation deteriorated and the Spanish betrayed them during a religious festival, massacring the unarmed nobility in the courtyard of the Great Temple, the Aztecs fought back with brilliant ferocity. The leadership fell to Cuitlahuac, Moctezuma's brother, who took command in 1520.
Cuitlahuac is the defender who proved the Aztec military machine was still highly capable. He organized a massive counteroffensive. On the night of June 30, 1520, an event the Spanish called the Noche Triste, or the Sad Night, Cuitlahuac's forces shattered the Spanish and their allies.
Wow.
They drove them out of Tenochtitlan along the causeways, inflicting massive casualties. The Spanish lost the majority of their forces, their gunpowder, and their looted gold in the waters of the lake. Cuitlahuac proved the Spanish were entirely defeatable.
But Cuitlahuac's reign only lasted 80 days. He didn't die in battle. He died from the invisible weapon that truly broke the empire. Which brings us to the final emperor, Cuauhtémoc, the cousin of Moctezuma. He inherited an empire that was not just under siege by foreign weapons, but was collapsing from the inside out.
Cuauhtémoc led the final desperate defense of the city during the grueling siege of 1521. Even when the mathematical certainty of defeat was obvious, when the city was starving and surrounded, he continued to coordinate resistance street by street, canal by canal. He stands in the historical record as a figure of immense dignity, embodying the resilience of his people as their universe literally fell apart.
And this connects so deeply to how you, the listener, view the world. Your notes reflect a refusal to flatten the human experience into easy categories of good guys versus bad guys. You understand that people are shaped by pressure, by loss, and by the primal, terrifying need to survive. Moctezuma, Cortez, Tlacaelel, Cuauhtémoc, they were all humans caught in a moment where the tectonic plates of history shifted faster than anyone could comprehend, making choices with a gun to their heads.
Which brings us to the mechanics of the fall itself. The collapse of the Aztec Empire between 1519 and 1521 was a perfect storm of catastrophic convergences. It wasn't one single factor. It was a cascading, systemic failure.
Let's break down that storm, because it dismantles the myth that the empire fell simply because it was culturally inferior or inherently weak.
This raises an important question. Did it fall because it was weak? No. The first and arguably most devastating factor was disease. The Spanish introduced smallpox to a virgin population that had absolutely no immunological defense against it.
It's just devastating.
The outbreak swept through Tenochtitlan and the surrounding basin right after the Noche Triste. It didn't just kill indiscriminately, it decimated the leadership class, the military veterans, and the agricultural workers. It caused massive social and psychological trauma precisely when the empire needed peak organization to repel the Spanish counterattack.
The disease completely changed the math of the war. While the Aztecs were burying their emperor Cuitlahuac and dealing with an apocalyptic plague, Cortez was resting and rebuilding his alliances in Tlaxcala.
The second factor was the strategic contact shock. The Aztecs had no historical precedent for the type of warfare the Spanish utilized. Mesoamerican warfare, as we discussed, was largely about capturing prisoners for sacrifice and subordinate tribute.
Right.
The Spanish fought a war of total destruction. They brought steel swords, which didn't shatter like obsidian. They brought war horses, which terrified the infantry and broke their formations. And crucially, Cortez utilized the geography against them. He built a fleet of shallow draft brigantines, mounting cannons on them, and launched them into Lake Texcoco.
That is a brilliant and brutal tactical move. He took the lake, the very thing that provided Tenochtitlan its ultimate defensive moat, and turned it into a naval blockade.
Exactly. The final factor was the siege itself. Cortez and his massive coalition of indigenous allies cut off the causeways. They destroyed the Chapultepec aqueduct, instantly cutting off the fresh water supply to hundreds of thousands of people.
And the food.
They blockaded the canoes bringing food from the Chinampas. The most brilliantly structured, highly disciplined city in the Americas was slowly starved to death. By the time Cuauhtémoc surrendered in August of 1521, the city was entirely in ruins, the canals choked with the dead.
Looking at the totality of this perfect storm, it forces a massive historical question. Did the Aztec Empire fall because it was fundamentally flawed? The evidence we've unpacked suggests no. It fell because its hidden weaknesses, the cracks in the tribute system and surrounding enemies, were exploited during a massive contact shock.
But the narrative does not end with the fall of the capital. It is a massive misconception that the Aztec people simply vanished into the jungle. The political system of the Triple Alliance was dismantled, yes. The Templo Mayor was destroyed. But the people survived.
The transformation into New Spain is a story of incredible, agonizing resilience. The Spanish didn't abandon the lake. They drained parts of it and literally built the capital of the Viceroyalty of New Spain, what is today Mexico City, directly on top of the ruins of Tenochtitlan. They used the same stones. They used the same indigenous labor force.
And the culture persisted. The Nahuatl language survived and is still spoken by millions today. The agricultural knowledge of the Chinampas, the culinary traditions of nixtamalized maize, beans, and chili, the deep-seated cultural memory, it all wove itself into the fabric of the new colonial reality.
Yeah.
They were subjected to horrific trauma and domination, but they engaged in a complex process of negotiation and survival. They adapted to the brutal new world, just as their ancestors had adapted to the salty swamps of Lake Texcoco.
As we bring this deep dive to a close, I want to speak directly to you again regarding the very last note you shared with us about your own personal evolution. You described a profound shift in how you operate in the world in 2025. You said you evolved from being a fire starter, someone who thrives on raw, wild, chaotic energy, into a firekeeper, someone who takes that intense heat and channels it into intentional, sustainable structure to keep the people around you warm.
That analogy perfectly captures the arc of the Aztec civilization. They began as desperate mercenaries, fire starters wandering a hostile basin. They took the dangerous geography of a swamp, the pain of constant warfare, and the terrifying apocalyptic intensity of their cosmic beliefs, and they built an incredible structure to contain it.
They turned dangerous geography and pain into disciplined beauty. They transformed the raw struggle for survival into something profoundly meaningful. And the ultimate takeaway here, the thing that resonates so deeply when you study this history, is that the fall of the empire shows that building something beautiful in a wild, unpredictable world is worth doing, even if it doesn't last forever. History is just people trying to survive storms they didn't choose, making the most vibrant life they can in the meantime.
And that leaves us with a final philosophical concept to mull over, building on the mechanisms we've explored today. Consider the Aztec belief in cyclical time and cosmic debt. They believed their world was not a permanent guarantee. It required daily physical sacrifice and intentional action just to keep the sun moving. If we, in our modern world, viewed our own institutions, our cities and environments, not as permanent guarantees, but as fragile systems that require our daily intentional nourishment to survive the night, how differently would we live tomorrow?
That is a question that sticks in the mind. Thank you for bringing such incredible resonant notes to the table and letting us pull apart the mechanics of this world with you. Until next time, keep the fire going.